A man in China in 1931 wakes up to find his entire village underwater. He climbs a tree to survive. He will stay in that tree for 6 days. 2 million people will not be so lucky. This isn't the deadliest war in history. It isn't a bomb, a genocide, or a plague you've heard of. It's a flood almost nobody remembers, and it's about to change how you think about the worst way to die. Humanity has been dying in spectacular, horrifying, and almost unimaginable ways for thousands of years, from volcanoes that swallowed cities in seconds, to diseases that erased a third of a continent, to genocides engineered with terrifying precision, to a single afternoon in 1945 that ended a war and opened a new kind of nightmare. Today we're counting down the worst deaths in recorded history, not just the biggest numbers, but the ones that reveal something disturbing about how fragile, how cruel, and how strange human extinction events can be. Buckle up. This one gets dark fast. August 24th, 79 AD. Mount Vesuvius, a mountain the people of Pompeii didn't even know was a volcano, splits open. Within hours, a column of ash and pumice shoots 20 miles into the sky. For the first several hours, it's almost survivable. Ash rains down, roofs collapse under the weight, but people are fleeing. Then, in the early hours of August 25th, everything changes. A pyroclastic surge, a wall of superheated gas and volcanic debris moving at 100 miles per hour, at temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Celsius, rolls down the mountain and slams into the city. Here's the part that still makes archaeologists queasy. The heat was so extreme, so instantaneous, that many victims died in a fraction of a second, their bodies frozen mid-motion, before the ash even fully buried them. Centuries later, excavators pumped plaster into voids left by decomposed bodies in the hardened ash, and what emerged were casts of the dead. A mother curling around her child, a dog straining against its chain, a man covering his face. Over 1,500 bodies have been found in Pompeii and neighboring Herculaneum, but researchers estimate the true death toll from the eruption reaches into the thousands, with entire communities simply erased from the map. But that wasn't even the worst part. In Herculaneum, a coastal town closer to the volcano, hundreds of residents fled to boat houses along the shore, believing the sea was their escape route. Skeletons found in the 1980s show they died instantly, some with skulls literally cracked open by the heat, brain tissue vitrified into glass. It's one of the only known instances in human history of a person's brain turning to glass from thermal shock. Fast forward to 165 AD. Roman legions returning from a campaign in Mesopotamia bring home more than victory. They bring home a disease nobody in the empire has ever seen. Historians believe it was smallpox, though some argue measles. Either way, it doesn't matter what you call it when it kills 5 million people. The Antonine Plague swept through the Roman Empire for over a decade, and unlike a battle or a single disaster, this was slow, grinding, relentless death. Entire legions were wiped out before they could even reach the front. The Roman physician Galen described it firsthand. Fever, vomiting, blackened skin, a rash that covered the entire body within days. At its peak, the disease reportedly killed 2,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. Here's a quick recap before we go further. We've already seen instant, thermal death at Pompeii, and slow, invisible death spreading through an empire in Rome. Notice the pattern already forming. Some of history's worst deaths happen in an instant, and some unfold over years. Keep that contrast in mind, because it's about to get much darker. Genos trading ships dock in Sicily. On board, most of the sailors are already dead. The ones still alive are covered in black boils. Within days, the disease is on the mainland. Within 4 years, the Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on black rats, will kill an estimated 25 to 50 million people in Europe alone, somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire continent's population. The death itself was agonizing. Buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes, would form in the armpit, neck, or groin, growing to the size of an apple, before rupturing. Victims experienced fever, delirium, vomiting of blood, and in the most severe septicemic cases, skin turning black from internal bleeding, hence the name. Death could come in as little as 3 days from first symptom. Entire villages vanished. Mass graves called plague pits were dug outside every major city, and in some towns there were simply not enough living people left to bury the dead. Church bells stopped ringing because there weren't enough clergy left alive to perform funeral rites. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio, watching the horror unfold, wrote that brother abandoned brother, and parents abandoned their own children, out of pure terror of contagion. But that wasn't even the worst part. The Black Death didn't just kill. It broke the fundamental structure of medieval society. Labor shortages were so severe afterward that the feudal system itself began to crumble, arguably setting the stage for the Renaissance. A plague indirectly reshaped the next 300 years of European history. Now we move from disease to deliberate slaughter. Between 1206 and 1368, the Mongol Empire, built by Genghis Khan and expanded by his descendants, killed an estimated 40 million people. Some historians argue the true number, when you account for famine and disease triggered by the destruction of infrastructure, could be as high as 60 million, at a time when the entire world's population was only around 400 million. The Mongols didn't just conquer. They perfected terror as a military strategy. Entire cities that resisted were given a choice: surrender immediately, or be annihilated down to the last living creature, including the cats and dogs. When the Khwarezmian city of Urgench resisted in 1221, the Mongols reportedly assigned 24 prisoners to execute 24 residents each, resulting in a death toll historians estimate between 200,000 and 1.2 million people in a single city, in a matter of days. Skulls were stacked into pyramids as warnings to the next town. Rivers were said to run so thick with blood that Mongol horses refused to cross them. And it worked. City after city surrendered without a fight rather than face what happened to those who didn't. Quick recap. We've gone from a volcano, to a plague, to a pandemic, to now, deliberate, engineered mass slaughter as a military tool. From here on, the deaths get less natural disaster and much more human choice. That's where things start to feel truly disturbing. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly loaded onto slave ships bound for the Americas. Of those, historians estimate roughly 1.8 million died during the crossing itself, the notorious Middle Passage, before ever reaching land. Conditions below deck were engineered for profit, not survival. Human beings were chained together in spaces sometimes less than 2 feet high, packed so tightly that disease spread within days. Dysentery, known on board simply as the flux, left the lower decks coated in human waste. Death rates on some voyages exceeded 50%. There's a story, documented in the historical record, of the slave ship Zone in 1781. When the ship ran low on water, the crew threw over 130 enslaved people overboard alive, not to save them from suffering, but because the ship's insurance only covered enslaved people lost at sea, not those who died from mismanagement. It became a landmark case not because anyone was punished for murder, but because it was argued in court as an insurance dispute over cargo. That detail alone, that the deaths of over 100 human beings were legally treated as a property claim, remains one of the most chilling footnotes in the entire history of the slave trade. Between 1845 and 1852, a potato blight destroyed Ireland's staple crop. But the disease alone didn't kill an estimated 1 million people. British policy did much of the rest. Food exports from Ireland to England continued even as people starved, and relief efforts were structured around free market ideology rather than emergency need. 1 million people died. Another 2 million fled the island entirely, permanently reshaping Ireland's population. Nearly a century later, in 1943, a similar horror unfolded in Bengal, India, then under British colonial rule. Wartime policy diverted rice supplies for military use, while officials in London reportedly resisted emergency shipments. An estimated 3 million people starved to death, sometimes lying dead in the streets of Calcutta while grain continued to be shipped elsewhere. These weren't natural famines. They were the result of decisions made by people who never had to watch anyone starve. Retention hook. You might think it can't get more calculated than deliberately withholding food from millions. It can. And it's about to. In 1885, Belgium's King Leopold II claimed the Congo as his personal property, not a colony of Belgium, but literally his own private estate, larger than all of Western Europe. Over the next 23 years, An estimated 10 million Congolese people died under a system built entirely around rubber extraction. Villages were assigned rubber quotas. If a village failed to meet its quota, Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, was ordered to punish them, and the punishment of choice was amputation. Soldiers were required to prove they hadn't wasted bullets by bringing back a severed hand for every bullet fired. This led to soldiers cutting off the hands of living people, including children, when they missed their targets or fell short on ammunition. Photographs from missionaries, of children with amputated hands and feet, eventually shocked the world and helped end Leopold's personal rule over the territory in 1908. But by then, roughly half of the region's entire population was already dead. The Ottoman Empire, collapsing and paranoid during World War I, begins a systematic campaign against its Armenian Christian population. An estimated 1.5 million Armenians are killed over the following years, through mass shootings, but overwhelmingly through forced death marches into the Syrian desert with no food or water. Entire families were marched for hundreds of miles. Survivors' accounts describe rivers so full of bodies that the water became undrinkable, and desert routes littered with the dead for months afterward. It's widely considered one of the first modern genocides, and disturbingly, it became a case study. Adolf Hitler reportedly referenced it decades later while planning his own atrocities, reportedly asking rhetorically who, after all, still remembered the Armenians. Quick bridge. Notice how each chapter has been building: natural disaster, disease, conquest, economic cruelty, colonial greed, and now, genocide as deliberate state policy. We're about to enter the darkest stretch of the video. This is where the numbers stop feeling real. 1932 to 1933. Joseph Stalin's Soviet government imposes impossibly high grain quotas on Ukraine, then seals the borders so starving people cannot leave to find food elsewhere. Homes were searched, and any hidden food, even a jar of preserved vegetables, was confiscated as hoarding. An estimated 3.5 to 5 million Ukrainians starved to death in under 2 years. Survivor accounts describe villages where every single person died, where the only sound was wind through empty houses. There are documented, harrowing accounts of parents driven to unthinkable acts of desperation by starvation-induced madness. Stories so disturbing that Soviet authorities printed public posters simply warning that eating your own children was, quote, an act of barbarism. The fact that such a warning was considered necessary tells you everything about how far starvation had pushed an entire population. April 1994. In just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people, mostly ethnic Tutsis, are killed in Rwanda. That's a killing rate faster, per day, than the Holocaust. The genocide was organized with terrifying efficiency. Radio stations broadcast the names and addresses of targets. Neighbors killed neighbors, sometimes former friends, using machetes because bullets were considered too expensive or too merciful. Roadblocks were set up every few hundred meters, where identity cards, which listed ethnicity, a bureaucratic detail left over from Belgian colonial rule, decided in seconds whether you lived or died. Churches, which should have been sanctuaries, became some of the worst massacre sites in the entire genocide, because people trusted holy ground would protect them, and it didn't. In one church in Nyamata, an estimated 10,000 people were killed in a single location. The building still stands today as a memorial, blood-stained clothing still piled on the pews. 1941 to 1945. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, systematically murders 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable, bringing the total death toll of Nazi persecution to an estimated 11 to 17 million. What made the Holocaust uniquely horrifying wasn't just the scale, it was the industrialization. Camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau were engineered like factories, with gas chambers disguised as shower rooms and crematoria built specifically to process the number of bodies the killing was producing. At its peak, Auschwitz was capable of killing and cremating an estimated 6,000 people per day. Trains ran on published schedules. Paperwork was filed. Death became bureaucracy. Survivors describe arriving at the camp and, within an hour of stepping off the train, being separated from their families forever by a single hand gesture from an SS officer deciding, essentially at random, who would live to work and who would die that same day. Dr. Joseph Mengele, stationed at the platform, became infamous for conducting this selection personally, a detail that still haunts survivor testimony to this day. But that wasn't even the worst part for many survivors. It was what came after, discovering, years later, that entire family trees, going back generations, had simply ceased to exist in the span of a single afternoon. Between 1959 and 1961, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, an attempt to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into an industrial power, triggered the deadliest famine ever recorded. Estimates range from 15 million to as high as 55 million deaths, with most historians settling around 30 to 45 million. Local officials, desperate to report success to Communist Party leadership, falsified grain production numbers, sometimes claiming yields many times higher than reality. Based on these fabricated numbers, the state then extracted grain quotas that left nothing for the farmers who grew it. People were forced to melt down farming tools for a failed backyard steel production campaign, while the actual harvests rotted or were shipped away. Entire rural provinces starved while officials, terrified of contradicting the party line, reported record harvests to Beijing. Documented accounts from the period include instances of extreme starvation-driven desperation so severe that local party records themselves acknowledged them, rather than the events being invented by outside critics. It remains one of the most tightly controlled and least discussed atrocities in modern history, in part because access to Chinese archives on the period remains heavily restricted even today. Remember the man in the tree from the very beginning of this video? Here's his full story, and why it might be the single worst mass death event most people have never heard of. In the summer of 1931, after years of drought followed by unusually heavy snowmelt, the Yangtze, Huai, and Yellow rivers all flooded simultaneously across central China. Cyclones dumped record rainfall on top of an already swollen river system. The result, an estimated 51 square miles of land underwater, affecting a region home to 53 million people. Estimates of the death toll range from 400,000 up to 4 million, with many historians landing around 2 million, making it, by many measures, the deadliest natural disaster ever recorded in human history, worse than any single earthquake, tsunami, or hurricane on record. Survivors describe entire cities like Wuhan submerged underwater for months. People built makeshift rafts out of doors and furniture. Others, like the man from our opening, simply climbed trees and waited, for days, sometimes weeks, watching bodies of neighbors, farm animals, and entire homes float past beneath them. Disease followed almost immediately. Cholera and dysentery spread through the floodwaters, killing as many people as the flooding itself. Famine followed the disease, as farmland that would normally produce the next harvest remained submerged and useless for the rest of the year. Unlike a war or a genocide, there was no single villain here, just geography, weather, and catastrophic bad luck converging in the worst possible way, at the worst possible place, killing more people in a matter of weeks than most wars kill in years. It's the most devastating event on this entire list, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. Every single event on this list, whether caused by nature, disease, or human hands, shares one disturbing thread. The deadliest moments in history rarely come with warning sirens. They arrive disguised as ordinary weather, ordinary politics, or ordinary bureaucracy, right up until they aren't ordinary anymore. Maybe that's the real lesson buried under all these numbers. If the man in the tree, or Auschwitz's platform selections, or the church in Nyamata hit you hard, you need to see our next video, Every Genocide of the 20th Century, Explained. Which of these events did you know the least about before watching? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of dark history keeps you up at night in the best way, subscribe, because we go even further next week.